I think people have an inherent and understandable fear that this AI is going to take their job.
Mental health is really huge on my lifestyle and the things that I like to push forward because the way in which we navigate life has dynamically changed.
I want to be the first to say I'm not an expert, and I have been a little intimidated to kind of jump into this and learn, but we can't tackle something or see its potential unless we do engage. I mean, think about Amazon with, we are all like wedded, like, what do you mean it's going to take more than 24 hours for me to get this thing that I want? Like, we have no patience, right?
I always had a real rub against being in the office because I was like, it's not necessary. And then the pandemic occurred and I saw how isolated everybody was. And I have to be honest with you, I'm really itching to kind of figure out in the next couple of years how we bring everybody back together.
I don't like the phrase work-life balance. I think that we are holistic, integrated people, and we hopefully can be the same person that we are at work, that we are at home, and share some of those things. So
all right, guys, welcome back to another episode of the Heart and Hustle podcast. We're back for a specific episode in our new HR Heroes series, and I'm incredibly excited because I've got Libby Nicholson here. Libby, thank you so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for offering for me to be here.
I'm excited to dive into today's conversation because we've got a lot of topics that we're going to cover. But first, I want to start off with a quote. Education is the passport to the future, for tomorrow belongs to those who prepare for it today. Malcolm X. What do you think about that quote?
Well, given that I work for an education travel company, I think it's awesome. I think that, our company's slogan is opening the world through education. So I resonate highly with that.
I had an interesting experience like many millennials. So I was born in 1990 and I remember being in second grade and coming home from school one day and being like, Mom, how much longer do I have to do this whole school thing? Because it just doesn't vibe with me. I wasn't one of those kids who was intently kind of drawn to the education process. But the one thing that I've recognized as I've gotten older is that I have become a ferocious learner. I love consuming knowledge, and I've realized how many doors it's opened up for me as I've gone through kind of my maturity process. Have you had a similar experience, or what was your education experience like when you were growing up?
I think I was the firstborn of 5 children, so there was a lot of that rule following pressure to like do and be the right things. And I was very fortunate in my education. I think had a lot of really good opportunities and great teachers. But there was a lot of what felt like just jumping through the hoops to get where we needed to go, and not as much pursuing something because you were really interested in it, but because that was just the next item in the curriculum. So I think now people have so many more options to pursue something because they have an interest in it and they can go deeper, and they're more passionate about it. And so they learn more.
And I feel like education comes in so many different forms these days, right? I want to say that Elon Musk famously a couple years ago said that because there's so much available information on like YouTube as an example, you have the ability to go out and really hone your skills around education that's readily available. And I feel like the dynamic of education has changed, but it opens up the world like you were talking about in your organization from the very beginning, which is kind of like a huge shift. Now, one of the other shifts that we've seen over the last couple years is kind of a way in which the workforce is now approaching work-life balance, but also the way that we work as well. And so the new way of work has been transforming right in our eyes over the last couple of years, especially. In our previous conversation, you had mentioned, some of the things that you and your organization are doing in changing the culture, especially as we have this new young generation who's coming into the workforce. What are some of the elements of the new changing workforce that you've kind of recognized?
I think I have my own coaching practice too. So it's not just at my organization, but I think in general, so many people that I see, especially coming out of the pandemic, the tolerance that people had for some of the things that they used to just kind of suffer, they just don't anymore. They're like, here's what I'm willing to do. Here's what I'm not willing to do. And so I would say the biggest one is just moving. We all were very remote, 100% remote. Kind of this return to hybrid work has probably been one of the biggest ones. I like to use the phrase connection with purpose. We have people come into the office for a reason. It's not just to say you have to be here so many days per week, as it is we have things we're doing on those days where we believe there's a lot of value in seeing each other and doing planning and working together and hearing the value. I think, especially for the younger members of the workforce, of a question asked in a group that you're like, oh, yeah, that's a question that I have too. I'm really interested to hear how somebody else with more or different experience is going to answer that so that I can learn. You don't get those experiences in isolation.
And that's actually been part of my, I would say, entrepreneurial journey. When I started my company back in 2014, I've always been a work from home person, right? My team is remote. We're across the country, Seattle, Arizona, Texas, Florida, all these places. And I always had a real rub against being in the office because I was like, it's not necessary. And then the pandemic occurred and I saw how isolated everybody was. And I have to be honest with you, I'm really itching to kind of figure out in the next couple of years how we bring everybody back together, because there's no replacement for being in the same space and being able to collaborate, ask questions, have things answered, but also that in-between time of just being able to spit off ideas to people and getting that collaborative nature, I think is so interesting.
Yeah, Keenan, I'm so glad you brought that up. I think, I worked remotely for 9 years before I, took this most recent job where I'm in a hybrid environment. And so I was the same way. I was really militant, like, we don't need this. We don't need that. We can do it all remotely. And I definitely do see a lot of that value. And even in a remote team, the value of bringing people together, whether it's on a quarterly or, every twice a year or something, just gives people that shot in the arm of that mission, purpose. Oh, these are my people. This is why I do what I do. And we all want to be part of something bigger than ourselves. And so I think that inspiration that comes from some of that community, unfortunately, we just can't replace it virtually as much as we have all tried.
And I feel like our organizations have to be more dynamic than ever. And that's kind of a perfect segue into a study that I shared with you about the 4 levels of organizational maturity model. Now, only 4% of organizations surveyed in this study actually are considered dynamic organizations. And here are some of the interesting criteria or characteristics of those organizations. Number 1 is focused on balanced outcomes. Number 2 is including innovation and productivity. Number 3 is focused on skill-based and cross-functional team play. Number 4 is data-informed. The 5th one, which I think is very powerful, is psychological safety. Especially in the world of mental health and burnout and turnover, resiliency challenges, psychological safety is so important. The next is always transforming. So like we talk about, shifting and being able to meet people and organizational needs where they are. And the last is a marketplace for internal mobility and career development. What I want to kind of do is, based on what I shared with you, let's talk about including innovation and productivity. How many organizations do you see that are out there today really focusing on this innovation aspect and how it can impact our productivity?
Yeah, I definitely am going to focus on that. But I think a really important statement before we do that is the Gallup organization has a statement, which is people don't leave companies, they leave managers. So on that psychological safety point, I think it is just so important to remember that what we're teaching our managers, just because somebody's been good at a job doesn't mean they're going to be good at leading somebody else doing it, and the way we're setting people up for success. And do we create those environments where people feel safe to come and ask questions and learn and build and grow? So I think that, if we think about Maslow's hierarchy, that we have to have that environment for some of that psychological safety before we can get to some of these other layers, right? So leading into productivity, assuming we have that great baseline of people feeling psychologically safe, that they have a manager who is supporting and encouraging their development, I think that is great. But I think getting into productivity, there are so many different tools. And it's so interesting to me as we look at the different generations coming into the workforce. I have a lot of employees who are younger and they've only ever been on a tablet or a phone. So even coming into a Microsoft like Teams or Slack or some of these, Windows-based systems, they're like, whoa, what is this? I'm used to being on an iPad or a phone. And so that's been an adjustment. But I think we have so many different ways of working together and being productive. But I think we have to start with sort of each person's individual, what works for you. And it's similar to, asking people to commit to the same planner. Like there are some things that work for you that might not work for me. And we have to kind of meet people where they are with some of that. But that's why going back to the manager being skilled, I think saying, what is it that you need? We all have these needs within us, and how do I help get you what you need? And what you need might be very different from someone else.
I feel like that is a huge change that I've seen in the last couple of years, especially because of the needs of our employees are so much more dynamic than they have been in the past. And I feel like business, especially from a large corporation perspective, through time has been very cookie cutter. Policies and procedures fit into the box, keep moving, do what you got to do. And in our previous conversation, you talked about this new generation of people who are coming into your organization asking questions and things of their managers, which in the past we wouldn't have even thought about. So why don't you kind of share a little bit about that personal experience and kind of if that took you back or if that surprised you or if that was something that you're intrigued by?
Yeah, I'm incredibly impressed with the willingness of the younger generation to advocate for themselves and with regard to whatever that might be. Sometimes it's around a personal need that they have. I think, coming out of the pandemic, people are so much more focused on their workspace. I was happy to get a desk wherever it was. And now I have people saying, here's what I need to be my most effective self. I'm like, oh, or, sometimes it's, I am challenging or thinking differently. I have a question about a policy or procedure. This doesn't make sense. And things that I don't feel like I ever would have had the courage to do at a younger age, I think I would have been like, well, the policy's here. I'm just supposed to follow it. And they're really comfortable with challenging the status quo and saying, that may be the case, but I don't know that it makes sense. And questioning that and in a respectful way. But I've learned a lot from some of those really great questions that they're bringing to the table. And I think great that organizations are now more receptive to allowing people to bring their full selves to work, whether that's from a diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging perspective to a neurodivergent, how do I learn best perspective, or whatever those things might be. I think we are much more open now than we were before to meeting people where they are.
Let's take this back to kind of like a first principles perspective. Why do you think this new generation has the ability to stand up and advocate for themselves when we and people who are in our same age bracket didn't think that that was a possibility? What are some of the elements in that?
Well, I think they were taught from an earlier age that they have a voice, that they have the ability to question things. I mean, when I was growing up, my parents were, they entertained a lot, would have people over, but it was a grown-up environment and we were there to be just, behave. And I think that things have really shifted a little bit more to not a kid-centric environment, but definitely more open. You see a lot more partnerships of people raising children together, and there's not a gender role or any kind of bias. It's all, everything's up for grabs. And I love that. But I think that people have been taught, like, you have a voice, you can come to the table. And also as a strengths coach, I love the fact that I can say, look, here's what I do really well. Here's what I bring to the table. What is it that you do? And we don't have to have roles that conform to what our friends have done or what our parents have done or whatever we've seen modeled for us. We can find our own path forward based on who we are. And I think that is a very unique perspective from what I grew up with.
Yeah, I know. My mom always used to repeat a saying to me because her mom said it to her when I was a kid. It said, children are to be seen and not heard. And I feel like that in itself is kind of an old school mentality. And maybe that's where a lot of this kind of, I would say, origin of this thought process goes is I'm supposed to show up, I'm supposed to sit in my desk, I'm supposed to be seen and not heard, not create too much havoc or, turbulence, if you will. But now the new generation is like, hey, if I'm going to be here and I want to be my best self, then I'm going to have the things that I need. And I feel like there's a dynamic shift by employers saying, okay, well, let's try this out. And if productivity and profit and, everything else and collaboration and the culture of the organization improves, maybe this is something that we can learn from as a way of the future.
Yeah. And I was very fortunate growing up to have parents who fully believed in equal opportunity and had just as many chores as my brothers did and, equally distributed. But that also taught me, even at a young age, being fortunate to be in rooms of a lot of, male-led executive teams, that I had a voice and I could speak up and say that doesn't really feel right or make sense, or have we considered this perspective? And I see now that was very unique and rare, that not everybody did. I'm seeing that shift, I think, with a lot more of that balance in, coming into the workplace now. But I think that environment has definitely shifted in terms of people learn and speak up in different
Yeah, I
ways.
want to take a little bit of a detour really quick because I want to learn a little bit more about your coaching. And you mentioned you're a strengths coach. So, what does that mean for the audience? How are you helping people show up and exemplify their best strengths? Or are you helping people put up 315 pounds in the gym, building their
Good
strength?
question. I am not a personal trainer. Yes, thank you for clarifying. So I am certified as a strengths coach with the Gallup organization. I've also done, certifications with different systems. And what I would say is, while I do love the Clifton Strengths Assessment, I don't think it matters so much which tool you're using. It's the philosophy of how are you wired? What do you need? And how do you ask for that and set yourself up for success with it? So I think I help a lot of times understand what people are good at. And I love to ask that question. Do you have the opportunity to do what you do best every day? Now, we're all going to have areas of our jobs that are not our favorite things. People say, well, I don't love doing email. Can I get rid of that? No. We're all going to have some things that we don't love every minute of every day. But I do think there are things that you do, how can we get you to be 70% in your zone where you are enjoying that work? Because that's what comes natural for you, and you are going to want to spend more time in those areas of strength. We gravitate toward that. So I do spend a lot of time with individuals and teams helping them understand, what are those things? Are we even aware that those are the strengths that we have? And then how do we move into applying them? So a lot of what I'll ask people is, you may have a talent to play the piano. Do you have an ability to practice? You're not going to get better unless you're leveraging that. So how are we moving into that application and ultimately achievement?
I'm so interested in this concept of strengths because as I've gotten more mature in my entrepreneurial journey, I've realized the importance of building out my team. Now, when I first got started, as many entrepreneurs do, they say, I can do everything. But I heard a influencer say something that really took me back. Have you ever heard of Mr. Beast? He's on YouTube. He creates these videos, gets like 60 million, 70 million views per video that he actually creates. Have you heard of him?
I've not heard of
Okay,
no.
so Mr. Beast is a influencer phenomenon, and he started off his journey very early by recognizing that I, as the leader of my YouTube channel, don't have the ability to do everything. And so he was having in a podcast, and he said, I recognize that although I might be good at video editing, I had to bring somebody in who had 100% of that strength. Because if I'm splitting my time 50-50, I'm only 50% as good as they are. And you can kind of look at that in building a team. So I love that approach of asking, what are you truly good at? And how can we put you in a position of strength so you can be successful long term? I think that is the congenial glue that keeps a team moving forward. And it's a challenge for a lot of leaders out there, especially in their early entrepreneurial journey, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think my goal is, how do we find those complementary partnerships where you say, God, I had a partnership one time where I didn't love doing research and getting really into data and analytics and, but I loved getting up in front of people and sharing ideas and being the mouthpiece for change. And I had the opportunity to partner with somebody who was like my perfect complement. Literally her bottom five strengths were my top five and vice versa. It was like a match made in heaven. And there were days where we were just trying to understand where the other one was coming from, for sure. But over the piece, like, it was such a great partnership because she could spend so much time doing things that she really enjoyed, and I could spend time giving voice and messaging things that she learned about or discovered. So I think when we can find some of those things, and that really to me is the definition of working smart and not working hard, because I do see so many, especially entrepreneurs, that just, I need to do it all. And you don't. You can find people who can do it in half the time. I'm the first to say I am not an expert in Excel, and I can partner with somebody who can do, I could spend, time and learn how to do it, but I'm always focusing people on what is the best and highest use of your talents, and how do we make sure you're in that space most of the time.
Yeah, I feel like that Excel example is funny to me because I always reference it. Everybody said back in the day that they were proficient at Excel on their applications and job stuff like that. But I feel like that's not everybody's bag, which is really interesting. And because we're talking about
Yeah, my daughter's a data science and engineer, and when I watch her do an Excel spreadsheet and a pivot table, I just sit back in awe and go, "This is awesome," but it is definitely not my
Yeah, my
strength.
girlfriend's sister is an accountant with a large gaming organization here in Las Vegas, and the way that she navigates her Excel files is absolutely mind blowing. And I feel like I'm just, somebody who's not going to understand that, so that's all up to her, which is great. Because we've been talking about the strengths of organizations, I want to kind of lean into the strengths of the dynamic organization or qualities that we kind of reviewed at the beginning of the call. And just so everybody understands, 7% of organizations surveyed were those dynamic organizations. We went through those characteristics, but let's talk about some of their strengths and how they outperform other organizations as well. So this is broken down into 3 categories. Business outcomes. These dynamic organizations are 3 times more likely to delight customers. They're 3 times more likely to exceed financial targets. Now, from a people outcomes perspective, 21 times more likely to be highly diverse and inclusive, 20 times more likely to accomplish high levels of workforce productivity, 31 times more likely to engage and retain employees. And then from an innovative perspective, 17 more times more likely to adapt to change, and 7 times more likely to innovate effectively. And it really kind of talks about those strengths, if you will, of having a collaborative team, being able to focus on outcomes and being data driven. And I know those are some of the things that you've been challenged with in your HR career. How do we use data as an example to better weaponize you to make better decisions? Why don't you kind of talk about that data dichotomy a little bit?
Yeah, and I'd love to circle back to our conversation earlier of working remotely and hybrid. And I think for a lot of organizations, the fear that is rooted in that is, well, how do I know if people are working? Well, if we have good data, I can easily look at that in outcomes. And I think, I want to focus on not so much where you sit to do what you're doing, but what are you achieving and are you doing it in a way that's working for you? And the only way that I'm going to be able to see that is in that data. So having some of those analytics and systems, not to mention the fact that we all want to feel like we're winning. We all want to be able to point to something and say, oh, look what I achieved. And having that data gives us that foundation to be able to have those conversations. I think if you look at performance management, that's such a good indicator. I often see companies that focus so much on, well, what's the rating going to be? And it's like that can destroy people at times. It's like if you say to somebody, you know what, you're a 3 out of 5, like they can't hear anything else except, what do you mean I'm a 3? Like, especially if you're a highly engaged individual, if you were to say to me, Libby, you're a 3, I would think I'd have to get my resume together. Like, that's unacceptable, right? Like, I think if you're dealing with highly driven people, they want to know how they're contributing, what impact they're having. And you have to be able to point back to that. And we do that with data. So having those analytics and telling that story of someone's work and evaluating productivity. And again, I think back to the generational thing, people are used to getting a lot of input very quickly. And that kind of ties back to, we don't want to wait once a year to give some of that feedback. We want to give those quick hits much more frequently. So having some of those resources where we can point to that and say, hey, today or this week, look what we achieved, either as a team or individually, is so important.
I feel like, all of the data points and stuff that we've talked about are kind of misunderstood by a lot of people unless they have a tangible example of an organization who's really doing this. And one of the great examples that I pulled from that study was how Netflix is attacking kind of all of the elements of that dynamic organization model. And some of the things that are really interesting, because when we talk about business, people care about output, right? So Google or Netflix has a employee outputs. So in millions of dollars, or $2.9 million of revenue per employee, which is more than Google, because Google has 1.5 million, 1.4 million for Meta, 660,000 for Comcast, and 450,000 for Disney, which is insane. And their stock price has outperformed Google over the last, or 4 times more over the last decade, which is insane. And if I think about the culture that I've always heard about and how they use feedback, how they use collaboration, how they use flexible working styles, Netflix seems to exemplify all of those things. What's your 2 cents on how Netflix has been able to dominate over the next decade by leaning into all those dynamic business models?
Well, I think people want to do a good job. They want to rise to the bar that you set for them. So I do think it's really important to have a high standard. But I also think we have to calibrate a little bit. Are the expectations that we're setting realistic, and how people are doing? And when people fall short of that, how are we having those conversations? Because I think there's also nothing worse than setting a goal that somebody just feels bad when they don't reach. Like that can have catastrophic effects across the board that we want to be aware of. So I think that there's a lot of tools out there for different employers to use, but each one of them, we have to be really clear that we understand what does that mean? How are they using that? Because I think uh, that's a lot of big data examples that you shared, and I think that those are great, but there's so many more people stories behind each one of those in terms of, you know, great place to work environments and what are they doing, but equally some challenging situations that I'm sure each of those people leaders could be sharing with you that they've overcome or navigated in the process. So I think a big part of it is just really understanding, you know, sometimes just setting goals for people. Are people clear on what it is their job is? I'm often amazed when I ask people, you know, what is it that you get paid to do? And they give you an answer and you're like, huh, it's not at all what I would have, as your manager or as a leader in this company, expected that answer to be. And I think I have a different expectation. So that calibration of regularly just checking in and saying we're all on the same page about what we're going after and what those goals are. And having been part of some really dynamic organizations, that's the other thing is these goals change. You know, I've been in part of one where they changed 6 weeks later. We would set a goal. And so we had this great goal. We're going to set goals and evaluate them after 1 year. We were like, they were all out the window in 2 months. And everybody was like, oh, now what? So we learned the value of setting them quarterly, reviewing them and pointing back and celebrating successes and also saying what didn't go well. And instead of beating people up for that, what can we learn from that? What can we do differently as a result? So I would imagine all of those organizations that you just shared probably have a lot of those types of situations embedded in there
Yeah,
somewhere.
and I feel like they're all really leaning into how they can utilize the progressive landscape of technology and tools like AI, as an example, to be able to take advantage of some of the things that are popping up on a week to week basis, right? I mean, technology, especially from the AI perspective, has exploded in the last couple of years. And we've seen organizations leaning into AI and how it can impact the organization. I want to reference a quick study. So the PwC organization predicts that a $15.7 trillion impact from now to 2030 will be made by AI in HR specifically. And some of the areas that you think it's going to touch might not be on this list, but there is a ton that I want to share with you. Recruiting, career mobility, org and job design, employee self-service, learning and development, rewards, employee experience is a huge one, leadership succession, and performance management. Now, I know that you've also been somebody who's starting to dive a little bit deep into the AI world. So why don't you give your perspective as an HR leader and how this new innovative tool has impacted kind of your worldview and how you can get your job done?
Yeah, I think AI is fascinating, and we're just starting to scratch the surface of some of the capabilities. I want to be the first to say I'm not an expert, and I have been a little intimidated to kind of jump into this and learn, but we can't tackle something or see its potential unless we do engage. So, you know, I took a class in, you know, Chat GPT and how to use it specifically for HR leaders. And, you know, a couple of the points that you referenced were taught there. One of them was recruitment. And it was really great to be able to see how, you know, ChatGPT can help you take the bias out of how you may evaluate candidates. You can do weighted averages and put in your top criteria for a job and then compare and contrast different candidates accordingly. And that was exciting because I think we're still people at the end of the day. We have inherent flaws and biases that we bring to the table. So I think that there's a lot of capability there. Similar to performance management, you know, there are things where it gives us that objective view on how we want to, you know, evaluate people. I also think, you know, there's ways where you can ask questions to say, I'm really scared. I need to give feedback about this particular, you know, particular topic, and what would you recommend? And my favorite thing so far about AI is that you're not starting from a blank slate, which is so great. I can't tell you how many times I've sat down to write a policy or procedure and I just like stare at a blank page and I'm like, I know somebody else has figured this out. Like I don't want to have to recreate the wheel. Um, so being able to enter into ChatGPT, like, can you give me a policy for a company in this industry on, you know, person paid time off, and it will spit out like all of this stuff. Now, a lot of it's not going to be relevant, but you can then start to wordsmith from there and say, what pieces of that do I want to keep? What might I want to change? You can pull it into presentations. So it's a great platform to jump into where, again, back to our talent discussion, what is the best and highest use of my time? it's not going out and seeing what's already there. So AI is kind of taking some of the heavy lifting out of that. And I think that we're only going to see this really, really grow and learn. I'm part of an HR roundtable that meets once a month, and this was our topic last week when we met, which is how is everybody using this? You know, what do we see? And a lot of people were like, I don't know where to start. They feel kind of stuck by that. So I just would invite people just jump in and start reading and learning and practicing, you know, just log in and play with it a little bit. Like you can't break it, you can only learn from it, which is
And
exciting.
that's where that sense of curiosity comes from, right? Because I feel like when ChatGPT dropped in November of 22, many people were like, this is going to be a good thing or this is going to be a bad thing. And it created that natural division, right? And there's also the perspective, which I love that you touched on, is everybody thinks you're either an AI expert or you're going to be somebody who's going to be left behind. But it's that sense of curiosity. That means let me dive into the system and see how I can use this to impact my job where the real benefit comes from. And I completely agree with you. ChatGPT is not supposed to be a replacement, but it's supposed to be an accelerator, right? Why would I go out and look at all the policies and procedures that I have to find manually when I can ask a system to create a first draft that I can then iterate on, right? The objective for innovation and collaboration is iterating on the ideas that we have and how we can become the best possible people that we possibly can. So I love that. Is there anything else that, from a concerns perspective, in your HR roundtable that people have brought up about HR or about AI in the role of HR?
I think people have an inherent and understandable fear that this AI is going to take their job. You know, what we all have that, like, what does this mean for me? You know, what if this can now do the work? You know, I saw some software where it can record you doing different things on your screen from a machine learning perspective. You teach it how to do it, and then it can do it for you. And immediately, for people who have very transactional jobs, I can totally see where that fear and that coming from a place of scarcity is hard. And so I think being willing to look at that and say, yes, that there is a potential that it may remove some of those more administrative roles or things in nature, but how can I use that to say, well, where can I jump in and maybe grow my career in a way that it can't? So, you know, it's not ever going to probably, at least in the short term, replace a lot of our emotional intelligence, like reading from somebody, you don't seem okay, what's going on today, and being able to have some of that insight and those conversations. You know, we're a ways off from that. And so I think that's probably the biggest hesitation and anxiety that people have around it. And I think we need to uh, respect that, but also just kind of be willing to come from a place of curiosity and
Yeah,
learn.
I mean, one of the organizations I shared with you that I feel like has a real curious mindset about things like AI is Walmart, which might surprise a lot of people. And not because of a logistics perspective and, timing out deliveries and making sure supply chain and stuff is there, which I'm sure there are elements of that. But the use case that I shared with you for how Walmart's using conversational AI is how they can support their employees about getting information about benefits. And some interesting statistics is Walmart, of course, like a large organization, employs a lot of call centers. When an employee calls the call center, they're getting 75% accuracy when their questions are being answered by people, but they're getting 95% accuracy from the AI tool. And it's very interesting. That might seem like a small jump, but when we talk about creating a sense of security, or a psychological safety as well, and understanding what benefits I can get from my organization, that jump from 75 to 95% is incredibly important. So what do you think about that use case? And have you seen anything else like that in business?
Well, first of all, as a recipient of so many of those benefits questions over and over and over, you know, you're just regurgitating a lot of the same answers. I find a lot of peace in the fact that there's a tool there, you know, so I know that we have software that has a bot associated with it that you can say, how much do I have in my vacation balance? You know, that's not something we need to bother the HR team with answering if it's something that an employee can utilize self-service to get on their own. And that's really another area where I think generationally, so many people are like, I just want to go and type in something and get an answer. I don't want to wait on hold, and I don't want to wait for a person or send an email and potentially have 48 hours somebody gets back to me. I want it right now. I mean, think about Amazon with, we are all like wedded. Like, what do you mean it's going to take more than 24 hours for me to get this thing that I want? Like, we have no patience, right? So the same is true for information. We want that right away. So being able to work smarter and have a system where people are going to say, when can I expect to receive my benefits card? Or when will I have coverage? Or a lot of these same questions that we receive in the benefits team over and over again. I think it's great because now I can put the human time and attention on the things that really matter, which is that person that just found out they're expecting, they need to take time off. How are they going to care for their children? Like, I want our time focused on those things and not on answering questions that potentially AI can answer for
Yeah, I
us.
mean, there's so many things I want to dive into there. I've always talk about with my team the consumer-centric approach to society today, right? Everybody wants when they want, what they want, when they want it now. And there was a comedian who I thought was really funny, and he was like, I moved from China 4 years ago, and I found that you Americans are so impatient. You guys have Amazon Prime that will deliver anything to your door next morning, but you're upset that that takes too long. He's like, what do you guys want? Amazon before? So even before you think about it, somebody's putting something in your hand and giving it to you. I thought that was really interesting and a unique perspective on kind of like the society that we live in as well, which I thought was interesting. One of the things I think is really interesting that I want to kind of do another detour on is because people want what they want when they want it, a huge element of how we can support employees today is around mental health. Why do you think mental health and wellness are two emphases for organizations today when it comes to attracting new talent? Why do you think that's so important on the roadmap for being able to nurture talent within the organization and make them feel psychologically safe, like we talked about earlier?
Well, first of all, I'm a huge advocate for mental health. And I think that, that's one of the reasons that I don't like the phrase work-life balance. I think that we are holistic, integrated people. And we hopefully can be the same person that we are at work, that we are at home, and share some of those things. So that's another thing that I really love, that I see a lot of the younger generation just advocating for themselves in terms of I can't go at this pace. I need a little bit of a break, or they work incredibly hard and say, sorry, I've allocated this time to make sure that I'm getting what I need from a wellness perspective. Or they'll say, if it's okay, I'm going to take 15 minutes. I just need to take a quick walk or clear. They know what some of these coping methodologies are that they need, and they advocate for those. And I admire that so much because I think for a long time there was situations in which people would just slog through and they would have nothing left in the tank at the end of the week, and it's not great. We want to make sure that people feel like they're able to do their best work, and they have to be getting what they need at home as well as at work. We're not just like, oh, this is the vacuum. I think that the show Severance is such a good indicator. I don't know if you've seen that, but it's fascinating to me, where it's like people kind of turn off. And I want our employees to be able to be and bring them their whole selves to work all the time and feel safe to do that.
Yeah, I mean, because at the end of the day, there was a recent study that I was reading for another episode, and it was talking about we're finding today that people are living to work, not working to live. Or I'm sorry, the reverse opposite. So working to live, not living to work. And I think there's a big disconnect with kind of the passion that people have, because often, and this is kind of a good example of my girlfriend's sister. She said, my role as an accountant is literally just so I can live my life and do the things that I want to. This is not something that I'm incredibly jazzed up about, but it's a means to an end so I can live the lifestyle that I want. And I thought that was interesting, but that seems to be a perspective that a lot of the youth share, especially as they go through kind of like their early professional careers as well. And I feel like in order for the future of organizations to be as successful as they can, we're going to have to make sure people show up heard, seen, validated, and they feel supported. Some of the work that me and the team do here at Francis is we started in the mental health space back in 2014. And during the pandemic, we found that a lot of organizations were really having a tough time supporting people on a daily basis. A lot of organizations allocate mental health resources, fractional counselors and therapists. They give you access to an EAP program. But unfortunately, because we're so busy every day, people don't take advantage of those things. So one of our services here at Francis is we send a daily text message of positivity, encouragement, support, or a mental wellness exercise that comes to you via text. So literally there's nothing that you have to do other than receive your daily dose of positivity. And we've seen some awesome impacts in the organizations we work with. And so mental health is really huge on my lifestyle and the things that I like to push forward, because the way in which we navigate life has dynamically changed, and we need to be able to adapt to these new needs.
I also think that there is a responsibility, though, on employers. For example, I had an employer that gave us access and paid for our access to Calm, to get the Calm app, which I think is great. You know, let's focus, let's do some of these things. That's amazing. What are we doing to action that? You know, to your point, are we actually giving space and time to people to use meditation and to be intentional about some of these things? Or is it just, well, in the 15 minutes of downtime that we give you in 24 hours, feel free to use the Calm app? Like, I think that we have a responsibility to make sure that we are checking in with people. Because I also, going back to what you said earlier on working to live, I have seen a shift where people are very mission driven. They want to be a part of something bigger than themselves, and they want to connect with the mission and purpose of that organization. So they really want to understand what the organization does, how do they fit in and connect to it. And I think that's a responsibility that employers have regularly, and again, not just once a year or every 6 months, but regularly saying, here's how you fit in, here's how you make a difference and connect to the bigger picture and what we do. Because I think when employees lose sight of that, they get more disengaged. So I think that people are willing to be really engaged during whatever commitment they're giving to their company. But I think that we also have an obligation as employers to make sure that we're connecting them to that purpose.
What that really comes down to is a terminology which I take a deep dive into in a lot of my content, which is the idea of agency, right? We start to feel burnt out. We start to feel like we don't have an impact when we don't understand how we play into the bigger picture. And that's a huge element of communicating with the team of like, this is your job responsibility. This is how you impact our customer journey. And this is the overall impact you're having on our community. Getting people to buy into that mission is just like a huge game changer that I feel like so many businesses lose out on because we're so focused on the day-to-day survival of business rather than the mission that we're on as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, you know, Libby, this has been an absolute pleasure hopping on here and learning a little bit more about you and your unique perspective, how you're being somebody who's innovating in your own circle of life by being someone who's curious enough to hop on AI, use ChatGPT. I know that people who are listening to today's episode in general are going to learn a lot from you. And we have so much that we can talk about continuously, but we're going to wrap up today's episode. I want you to give the last couple seconds of how can people contact you to figure out more about you and the work that you're doing as a coach, but also an HR leader, if that's on LinkedIn, a website, or whatever that is.
Yeah, thanks, Keenan. I appreciate that. Yeah, LinkedIn is great, Libby Nicholson. And I just would really encourage people, don't be afraid to try out new things. I think that we get scared, and just remember we're all in this together. We're all trying to figure things out. And I love it when people raise their hand and say, oh, I'm a little scared. I don't really know. Does somebody want to try this out? Like, we're all in figuring it out at the same time. Nobody's an expert. So there are some experts. I am not one of them. So I think it's fun to have people to network and try that out with.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much for tuning into another episode of the Heart and Hustle podcast. This has been a brand new segment in our HR Heroes section. So Libby, thank you so much again for coming in and sharing your insights. I really appreciate it. Guys, we'll catch you in the next one. Take it easy.